Welcome, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining this session on promoting transparency and convergence in the regulatory landscape as part of the series of events that we have today on COVID-19 vaccine supply chain and regulatory transparency. My name is Ho Lim. I'm the Director of the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO. I will be moderating this session. You have with you a very distinguished panel. I'll come to them shortly. And if you allow me just to say again, we're really delighted to have this opportunity to discuss with you, to have presentations by this eminent group of speakers representing a wide range of stakeholders from governments, regulators, private sector, international organizations. Now, why are we doing this symposium, and more particularly, why this particular session? It's because, to state perhaps the obvious, that regulatory issues are really key when we think about the vaccine supply chain. And of course, national regulatory authorities have a vital role to play in ensuring the safety, quality, efficiency of vaccines, which they have to approve for their populations. But at the same time, there's also the challenge of dissemination and access. And here, trade clearly plays a role in helping to get vaccines out. So regulatory issues are an important part of this challenge. If regulatory approaches are very different between countries, or let's say very cumbersome, they can slow or even block access to vaccines. And so therefore, in thinking about value chain issues, how trade and regulation come together is certainly a very key one, I believe. So for us at WTO, we pay a lot of emphasis to issues of regulatory cooperation. We have seen that the more that regulators can cooperate, be it through joint activities, through reliance or harmonization to international standards, the more they can do both better quality, better safety, and also facilitate trade. Um, this makes it, let's say, a very good practice to aim towards. And we know, of course, there are many efforts, not just at WTO, to try to streamline, harmonize, simplify regulatory processes. On our side at the WTO, one key forum and key instrument would be the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, and with it, the TBT Committee. And under this agreement, you have disciplines for technical regulations, for standards, conformity assessment procedures, so as to avoid discrimination, unnecessary regulatory barriers. And certainly a key aspect of the agreement is to promote harmonization to international standards and to the extent possible to avoid duplication. In the work that we've been doing on COVID-19 and vaccine access and supply chain, we've heard on various occasions the importance of dealing with both aspects, the technical barriers to trade, and at the same time, promoting and improving regulatory cooperation. So as we seek, and as I would say the world seeks rather than just we, to scale up manufacturing of vaccines in developing countries, as I said earlier, the regulatory dimension is certainly one that we really need to think about. At the same time, it's also been made known to us that many regulators in developing countries sometimes may lack the resources and infrastructure needed to ensure quality, efficacy, and safety. And this can indeed be an impediment to scaling up manufacturing. So this is really just a few words of context. You have before you, as I said, a very esteemed and very expert panel who are really going to give a deep dive into some of these issues. So I won't take up much more time, but to say that these were just some few words of scene setting. And maybe before kickstarting the panel, I can just mention how the session will proceed. I will be giving the floor to each of the panelists in turn. They will have some 7 minutes to make their initial response to one of the questions I will pose. Thereafter, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. For those of you participating, you can send your questions for the Q&A session as we are doing the presentations. You can do it through the chat box or the Zoom Q&A. I believe there's a specific Q&A section on Zoom that you can use. And we will do our best to come to you during the Q&A session. So with that, let's kickstart the session. And here I like to turn first to Dr. June Raine, who is Chief Executive of Medicines and Healthcare Products, MHRA of UK. And Dr. Raine, you were one of the first regulators in the world to approve a COVID-19 vaccine. Could you tell us about how you expedited your emergency authorization process and at the same time mitigated the risks that came along the way? And I think we would all be really interested in this experience. And also, how did you cooperate and share data with others? So Dr. Raine, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Holim, and it is a real pleasure to participate in this session at this very timely WTO meeting, promoting transparency and convergence in the regulatory landscape, never more important than at this time. I would like to share a couple of slides, if Devin could kindly just put them on the screen for me, and then I can move swiftly through the very short reflection that I'm now going to offer. So if Devin is there, if you could pull up the slides. In answering your question about how we expedited the approval of the vaccine, I'll first of all focus on the new approaches that we introduced as a regulatory authority, and then how we mitigated the risks using independent expert advice, using transparency, and using openness, working with others in a spirit of collaboration. And so if Devin is able to share some slides, I can move through them. Let me first, yes?
I think he's in the process of getting your slides.
That's fine, and I'll keep using the time fruitfully. To expedite approval as the regulatory authority, we introduced a whole range of regulatory flexibilities, very early interaction with developers, rapid approval of clinical trials, a rolling review of all the data on particular vaccines as they became available, and I'll say more about that, agile inspections, including GMP of sites, which would be new sites for vaccines, and importantly, we published guidance for the industry on flexible approaches to regulation as we were taking them. So if you could move to slide 4 now, our aim was to shorten the time for approval of vaccines from several years to under a year in view of the seriousness of the impact. And as you can see here, COVID-19 was having a very serious impact in the UK, and we wish to encourage overlap with phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials while we were preparing for large-scale production of vaccines at risk. We didn't even know at that point whether they would work. And for the first vaccine in the next slide, in terms of the regulatory approval phase, we undertook the rolling review. It's permitted as a tool in EU law for products for emergency use, but we really did this in earnest. From top down, our independent expert working group were proactively planning from the middle of 2020, preparation for batch testing with technology transfer starting again at risk, and the preclinical quality and interim analyses of clinical data were undertaken in parallel in real time. So when the final analysis was available in the middle of November, we were able to complete our benefit risk review in around 2 weeks. Importantly, in the next slide, we mitigated the risks of working in this expedited fashion in 2 main ways. The first was sharing data, and this was sharing data first nationally with our independent experts from a range of specialisms, and secondly, sharing the process and findings at public briefings. Turning now to international collaboration, I would say that the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities in the next slide, has been vitally important as a forum for an exchange of information and to address matters of policy, common approaches to agility of regulators, including in particular in relation to inspections, and also a very key piece of work on vaccine confidence that has been published and shared. And this slide quotes from the policy framework of ICMRA, published in 2019, which sets out ways for health regulatory authorities, HRAs, to engage in a coordinated response and communication on an international level in response to a global health crisis. And you might say, we've learned a lot since 2019. We certainly have, and now it's time to look at and refresh this document. But in terms of best practice, the focus now is to increase international collaboration and preparedness, and to look for the key bodies globally that will help prepare and inform this collaborative approach. So in the next slide, I've just simply highlighted some of the bodies in our regulatory world who are key to this. ICMRA, I have highlighted, the International Conference on Harmonization, and the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And of course, there are the MODERATORs. So there are a number of fora, all of whom have a role to play in preparedness. Finally, a recent publication from the G7 countries at their summit earlier this month sets out an even greater challenge for all of us, and that includes regulators. In the recommendations of the 100 Days Mission Report, there are proposals for an international network of clinical trials to ensure a coordinated and a very efficient approach to testing not just vaccines, but diagnostics and therapeutics. There are proposals for a common regulatory framework for diagnostics and an international alliance of stringent regulatory authorities coming together with the World Health Organization, and to exchange best practices for regulatory evaluation of other types of studies. We need to look beyond the traditional clinical trials if we are to move speedily. And that will include immunogenicity studies, human challenge studies, and so forth, if we are to achieve that goal of 100 days. And so in summary, Dr. Olim, preparedness, early engagement with developers, transparency, collaboration, and importantly, international convergence will all be vital to improving and to strengthening our response, not just to the final approach to delivering the globe from COVID-19, but any future pandemic that may arise. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute at this important time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raine. That was really very comprehensive and also very concise and very clear. Very much appreciated. I mean, as you were speaking, once you gave us already quite a number of lessons on what we should be doing and how we should be doing it for the next pandemic. And maybe as you think about it, as well as the other speakers, so a question also comes to us from time to time about what we shouldn't be doing in terms of the next pandemic, things that we should not be doing, and how we could improve on that. So that would be something I think be interesting to get back to you as well, and the others as we go through. So let me now turn to Dr. Rogério Gaspar from the WHO. Dr. Gaspar is Director, Regulation and Pre-Qualification Department at the WHO. I mean, clearly WHO plays a vital role in promoting regulatory cooperation, international regulatory cooperation and reliance, which is particularly important in all cases, but even more so in public health emergencies. So Dr. Gaspar, could you take us through a little bit on how does WHO's regulatory guidance help to speed up global access to safe, quality, and effective vaccines, including by facilitating trade? And maybe you could share with us a bit of your experience of how did you work with other regulators in the WHO pre-qualification process for COVID-19 vaccines? So please, Dr. Gaspar, we look forward to your intervention.
Thank you very much. I think now I'm on. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those that are participating at this symposium. It is a real pleasure to participate in this session devoted to promote transparency and convergence on the regulatory landscape. Let me tell you that, first of all, a regulation and regulatory system are something that many people have not given much thought before. But this pandemic highlighted the critical role of regulation and regulatory systems in ensuring that all health products, not just vaccines, but also medicines, diagnostics, and medical devices, the process to be safe, effective, and quality assured once in the market and in use on health systems. Some studies estimated that the overall time required for registration of new and innovative medicines or vaccines in resource-limited countries could take typically 4 to 7 years after a product is being used in high-income countries. Going through public health emergencies such as H1N1 in 2009-2010 and Ebola in 2014-2015, it was evident that we needed to develop an emergency-specific regulatory decision-making process that is fast, robust, and effective, but at the same time ensures quality, safety, and efficacy of urgently needed health products. Working together, regulatory agencies around the world, WHO prepared the basis of emergency use listing, EUL, for this mechanism in response to the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and demonstrated its usefulness by assessing the quality assured diagnostics for Ebola and Zika in previous pandemics. In January 2020, so prior to the declaration of COVID-19 pandemic, WHO pre-qualification teams completed the development of efficient and effective product assessment mechanisms to evaluate quality, safety, and efficacy of urgently needed investigational diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. Together with the WHO clinical guidelines and target product profiles, the first in vitro diagnostics were listed for EUL on the 3rd of April 2020, less than 1 month after the declaration of the pandemic on March 11. Joint assessment and inspection work with the European Medicines Agency on COVID-19 vaccines also demonstrated the effective use of time and resources, as well as additional layer to ensure assessment of safe, effective, and quality vaccines. In parallel, in order to support low and middle income countries to efficiently authorize the EUL listed vaccines, a special procedure was in place to share regulatory dossiers under confidentiality agreements and to promote the use of the reliance concept. The special arrangement and the adoption of reliance concept allowed 101 out of 145 countries to successfully authorize AstraZeneca vaccines with a record speed of less than 15 days. Normative work to develop evaluation guidelines and international standards are also a critical part of the preparedness. And we also provide normative guidance and technical assistance to collect adverse events, how to identify the key signals, and what actions to be taken accordingly. WHO does not do this work alone, but always in coordination with regulatory agencies and specialized experts around the world, including the Uppsala Monitoring Center, which is a WHO collaborative center. Let's look at how WHO has been working with the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, already referred by June in a previous presentation. ICMR consists of over than 30 regulatory agencies around the world. WHO has an observer status there, as we always have when the member states are present. And as you may have seen in the background documents that we facilitated before this symposium, WHO has issued 3 joint statements with ICMR. In November 2020, the statement on the need for improved global regulatory alignment on COVID-19 medicines and vaccines was issued, as the challenges are best addressed by working together to ensure existing rigorous scientific standards of review and oversight, and in order to maintain them through the crisis while still giving patients access to safe and effective medical products at the earliest time possible. Regulatory authorities for medical products, including medicines and vaccines, have the responsibility to approve quality assured, safe and effective products based on robust and reliable data collected through randomized controlled clinical trials which control for bias, meet good clinical practice standards, respect the rights, the autonomy, the safety of clinical trial participants, and can be audited. In May this year, we issued a statement on transparency and data integrity, as the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the importance of data to support academics, researchers, and industry in developing vaccines and therapeutics. At the same time, to support regulators and health authorities in their decision-making process, to support healthcare professionals in their treatment decisions, and also to support the public confidence in vaccines and therapeutics being deployed. Over 50% of the clinical trials are generally unreported by academic researchers and industry, often because the results are negative, and these unreported trial results have potential to hinder the design of best suited trials, cause unnecessary testing, and delay the development of innovative, safe, and efficacious treatments and vaccines. ICMRA and WHO call on the pharmaceutical industry to commit within short timelines and without waiting for legal changes to provide voluntary access to trial results data for the benefit of public health, while personal data and individual patient data should be redacted and protected. At the beginning of this month, we issued also a statement for healthcare professionals how COVID-19 vaccines are regulated for safety and effectiveness. The role of regulators in the oversight of COVID-19 vaccines is not well understood by healthcare professionals and public health authorities. And even in the middle of the pandemic, regulators have not cut the corner, but took a robust scientific approach to determine safety, efficacy, and quality of vaccines, and how safety is closely and continuously monitored after approval. Finally, and just to conclude, despite many challenges, we have made tremendous achievements to tackle COVID-19 during the past 15 months. We have learned a lot already from this pandemic, but we will continue learning and continue working together, coordinate and collaborate to speed up and facilitate global access to safe, effective, and quality health products and overcome bottlenecks and other challenges. So WHO also published regarding this the COVID-19 Research and Innovation Achievements in May 2021, which also highlights the gaps where we need to work on and the collaborative work between our sector and the R&D Blue sector inside WHO. Thank you, and sorry for the short delay.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Gaspar. I know I'm sorry we weren't able to give you more time, but it's really very fascinating, the range of things that you spoke about, and also I must say very impressive the different systems and different ways that you're trying to fill the gap. I agree with you that this is an area which maybe needs a lot more work on regulatory cooperation, and certainly we in WTO, to the extent that we can, would be really interested to see how we could help and contribute. So thank you very much for that. Let me turn now to Dr. Yasuhiro Fujiwara of Japan. Dr. Fujiwara is a chief executive of the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency of Japan. And so Dr. Fujiwara, welcome. I'm really glad they're able to join us. Thank you for taking the time. Maybe I could start with a sort of general question, like, how can regulatory cooperation, reliance, and work sharing, such as through the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authority, which we've heard about now a couple of times, can help expedite and streamline the development, authorization, and availability of COVID-19 vaccines worldwide? And maybe just a very quick follow-up, which would be that, as a member of the International Council for Harmonization, can you tell us about the steps that you took to quickly and safely approve COVID-19 vaccines? And as with the other speakers, to the extent that you could share with us what you think are some of the things that need to be done in the next pandemic, and also what shouldn't be done in the form of best practices, this would all be really, really helpful. Thank you, Dr. Fujiwara. I think you're still muted, Dr. Fujiwara.
Sorry, can I hear me?
Yes, that's good now. You're unmuted.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman. But I can answer your questions later on during maybe the panel discussion area. Before going to that panel discussion, I'll talk about something about the regulators' actions to combat COVID-19. I'm Yasuhiro, and today I would like to share regulators' actions to combat COVID-19 as the Chief Executive of PMDA, Japanese Regulatory Agency, and also from the representative of ICMRA as Vice Chair. At first, I will touch on what is International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, ICMRA. ICMRA is voluntary and leadership entity of regulatory agencies. The member is head of regulatory agencies. Currently, 24 agencies are a member, and 11 are associate member from every continent, and WHO is an observer. Recently, development and delivery of medical products are globalized. It means collaboration over the countries and regions becomes essential to take actions for emerging issues in pharmaceutical area. Considering this, ICMRA emphasizes the reliance, which is streaming responses and facilitation effort to multiple regulatory activities during the public health emergencies, such as Ebola and, of course, COVID-19. Regarding COVID-19, ICMRA released a statement on 20th April 2020. It was the early stage of COVID-19 pandemic to express we work together to facilitate and expedite the development and evaluation of COVID-19 products and overcome the crisis. The statement touched actions, commitments, and recommendations. You can read the details of each from the ICMRA's website. ICMRA has policy teleconference by head of regulatory agencies every 2 weeks, and also have technical teleconference every other week in order that regulators share most updated COVID-19 information and collaborate. In addition, workshops and set for specified topics as shown here. The key points of these workshops are composed by experts in each regulatory agency and published outcome report after each workshop. The report is described agreements and common approaches to facilitate the development of COVID-19 vaccine candidates and treatments. To share what we consider, what we require globally, this information is extremely important. So ICMRA put on the summary of each workshop in the website for transparency. I would like to shift to PMDA, Japanese Regulatory Agency activity, for a couple of minutes. Pardon? Can I continue? Okay, I will continue. PMDA is also making efforts to provide COVID-19 related products to patients and public as early as possible. All the information related to COVID-19 is summarized in a page that is regulations guidance for vaccine developments, approved products, and so on. Going back to the concept of what the regulation was made for, not what the regulation says. We take agilities on some regulations to facilitate product development and maintain existing clinical trials for other therapeutics. Another effort to enhance capacity building. Each regulator is under pressure to promptly deliver COVID-19 related products to all citizens, but some regulators don't have enough experiences to review such products and also to implement most post-market measures. To promote their regulatory capacity, PMDA established Asia Training Center for Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Regulatory Affairs in 2016. In this center, PMDA has been sharing the experiences, knowledge, regulatory thoughts for promoting vulnerable regulators' capacities. PMDA conducts lots of action to confront COVID-19, and these are published through PMDA website. Unfortunately, we opened it using our language, Japanese, so it is not able to be understood by people in other countries. It is so helpful all over the world people if we release them in English also. But full translation is a huge burden for PMDA. In order to share on COVID-19 activities with the global stakeholders in a timely manner, PMDA started the release of Chief Executive Statement. At the starting time, the statement covers only COVID-19 issues, but currently it has been expanding to cover other topics. For example, the statement mentioned utilization of real-world data. You can read them from PMDA website. This is the principle for the evaluation of vaccine against novel coronavirus. Transparency to publicize what we are thinking is essential for efficient vaccine development. As Japanese regulator, we primarily accelerate the vaccine development in Japan, but vaccines are developed globally, not domestically. So to show our thoughts in English is significant to facilitate the development also in Japan. Therefore, we also released the English version of the principle. This is the last slide. Today, I touched ICMRA and PMDA regulatory activities to combat COVID-19. PMDA alone and ICMRA alone cannot overcome COVID-19. Global collaboration in various fields is extremely significant, and each situation accelerates regulatory convergence for COVID-19 measures. We must clarify what we are thinking to stakeholders and work with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fujiwara. And thanks for sort of being very clear in your presentation, and also for taking us through some of the practical steps that were important. And it also struck me that some of the very practical things like language, as you were saying, is also something to be considered, something we take for granted, but obviously it's something that can be challenging and when we were trying to promote more regulatory cooperation. Let me move to the next speaker, Dr. Delese Mimi Darko from Ghana. Dr. Darko is a Chief Executive Officer of the Food and Drugs Authority of Ghana. So thank you for joining us. It's great to have you on board. And I think we would really be interested to hear about some of these issues that we've been talking about already from the perspective of Ghana. You were the first country in Africa to approve and receive vaccines through COVAX. And as a developing country facing this crisis, how did you move quickly and safely to enable the approval of vaccines? And how did you use the guidance of the WHO, which we've heard already, as well as actions of perhaps other national regulatory authorities? And as with all the speakers, if you have any points you'd like to make on best practices, this would be very much appreciated. So thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this meeting. So first of all, we, the Minister for Health declared a pandemic as a public health emergency in Ghana in March 2020. And immediately the president set up a national COVID task force, which included the FDA. And it is interesting to note that it was bang in the middle of this pandemic that the FDA became WHO maturity level 3. So a lot was expected of us. Now, as all regulators, we needed to ensure that we were prepared to face the pandemic. So what we did was we immediately activated our emergency use authorization guideline. And interestingly, this guideline was developed during the Ebola crisis with the help of AVREF. So a lot of the AVREF countries actually developed an EUA guideline. But we had ours fortunately published on our website from about 2019. We immediately then rallied around all our stakeholders, which included the local manufacturing industry, representatives of drug manufacturers, and we educated them on the availability of this EUA guideline and the fact that it was published, and then to see how the country could work during this pandemic and to have the necessary medical products available. We also set up a system before we even received any of the medicines. We set up an internal system on authorizing COVID-19 medical products. So we had a team of experts internally who are used to reviewing products. Some of them even do some work with EMA. We are involved in EMA evaluations and clinical trials. Some of them are with the WHO collaborative procedure and the collaborative procedure for Swissmedic. So we formed this team of experts, and they were the ones who actually reviewed and got into the review of vaccines and other products for COVID-19. And the system was set up such that there was also a peer review mechanism, and then escalated to an advisory committee for final approval. We also adopted the AVREF timelines of 15 days evaluation during a pandemic. And if the products being evaluated had already been approved by a stringent authority, the timeline was cut down to 10. So we formally adopted our AVREF timelines. We use the same timeline for clinical trials. One thing we did very well is that we worked well with research and academia and our standard setting body to develop standards for products that were not available to us because of lockdown. So we developed our own standards for face masks, other PPEs, and even for hand sanitizers. and all those with the support of the regulatory agency was available in country. So we didn't suffer too much from lockdowns and the fact that no imported products were coming in. Transparency was very key for us. So all our guidelines, including the EUA, as I said, were published on the website. We also published our fast track timeline so that anybody who was bringing anything for approval knew that there was a fast track timeline because of the pandemic. We also published when we started, registering products for the pandemic. Every 24 hours, a renewed list of products would be published on our website, or we also use social media a lot because many people were locked down at home and would resort to our list on social media to see what was available by way of products for the pandemic. We also had to publish a frequently asked questions on our processes, on adverse events to look out for, etc., so that people had access to them. So we were very transparent during this pandemic period. What we did well, we worked very hard actually took part in the 13-country, multi-country clinical trial. It was made up of 13 African countries called the Antikov Trial. And the feat was that all regulatory authorities from these 13 countries working with ethics committees together actually managed to approve this clinical trial in record time. And this was coordinated by WHO AVREF. We also adopted 3 regulatory pathways for approval of medical products. So we used Reliance, and our Reliance pathway guidelines is published on our website. We took part in collaborative procedures with using WHO AVREF. And if we were evaluating a product that had not been assessed by any of, WHO, had not been given listing by WHO or any other stringent agency, then would have to do the full assessment using the system that we had set up before. So with those 3 systems working very well for us, we've approved 3 vaccines so far. Covishield was done, Sputnik was done using full assessment, Johnson & Johnson was done using Reliance, and by tomorrow we will have access to do Pfizer and Moderna also using Reliance because they have been listed by the WHO. But even with that, we would still look at some data once we had access to data to ensure that it was the right thing for our population. And then we would issue an authorization to the Minister for Health. We also work very well with the expanded program on immunization, which is the agency that deploys vaccines. So before even the vaccines arrived, we had done some training with them on storage and then training on how to report adverse events following immunization, because as you're aware, these were new vaccines and the safety monitoring is very important. Once we received a COVAX supply, the regulator was responsible for inspecting the consignment and formally releasing every batch of shipments to the expanded program on immunization. And this was a formal release before the vaccines could be used. We also established a joint committee on safety that meets every 2 weeks, and to date they are still meeting. And this committee reviews all the adverse events that come out from vaccination with the vaccines that we had authorized. And from this committee, we publish every week an update on our website on vaccine rollout and adverse events. And every 2 weeks, we published, we had a publication in the media on the deployment and safety information. And the idea was that if we were transparent enough, people would know, there would be less vaccine hesitancy because they would know that the regulator was monitoring what was going on. We're also part of the AU, NEPAD, and Gates Foundation 3S project, which is a way of monitoring the safety and ensuring that we had all the safety data going into one database. Now, we started with 4 countries, Ghana, South Africa, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, and with technical support from the UK MHRA to monitor the safety and use what we call a device called the Med Safety app, which is a safety monitoring app that is on the phone. So we promoted the use of this app, and we meet every, I think, 2 weeks, the 4 countries meet and we discuss progress, look at adverse events that have been put into the database. So generally, we worked very well during this pandemic, and most of it was due to collaboration with even internally, collaboration externally, and technical support we got from MHRA, WHO, the Gates Foundation, etc. The way forward for Ghana now is the president has instituted a local manufacturing committee initiative to set up to ensure that we would not be caught out, because as you know, I think we have less than 1% of our population that has been vaccinated. And vaccine diplomacy, not getting vaccines for Africa is a big thing for us. So we have set up an interagency multisectoral committee, which was established in March. It is driven by the president, and the duty is to assess the feasibility of vaccine manufacture in Ghana to support not just Ghana, but the region. So in a nutshell, this is how we have handled the pandemic. We were slightly ready, but nobody has ever been fully ready for this pandemic. And we will go on to support the country to ensure we have the right quality of products, and then also to support the Africa region as a whole, to ensure that all products that are used during this pandemic are well assured of the right quality, the safety is well monitored, and we can collaborate to ensure that we all get out safely from this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Darko. That was really very interesting to see how some of the things that we've been talking about at a more sort of international level have been translated at the national level, and all the rapidity that these processes were set up and put in place. Towards the end, you mentioned local manufacturing capacity, and that seems like a good point for us to turn towards the manufacturers. So far, we've heard mainly from the regulators, and now I'd like to turn to Dr. Rajinder Kumasuri, who's from the Chief Executive Officer of the Developing Countries Vaccines Manufacturers Network. Rajinder, you represent a group of 41 vaccines manufacturers based in developing countries, several which are producing COVID-19 vaccines. You've heard a lot about the regulatory perspective. So can you tell us about the opportunities as well as regulatory challenges that your members encountered in producing and supplying COVID vaccines in different markets worldwide? This is a key part of the discussion, manufacturing capacity. And some of your perspectives on the contribution of regulatory alignment and reliance, both for improving access to vaccines and facilitating trade. So the floor is yours, Rajinder, and of course, anything else you would like to share with us, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Holim, for this very insightful question. And I would definitely try to do justice to that. But let me first start and respond to your last part of the question, and then I will delve into the challenges part. You just heard 4 regulators, and honestly, I think what is more critical and important is to understand the contribution of the regulatory alignment and reliance, specifically for improving access to vaccines and facilitating trade. And I would like to give kudos to all the regulatory agencies, especially EMA, USFDA, MHRA, PMDA, WHO, and local NRAs, especially in India, China, Brazil, Korea, Indonesia, South Africa, and Ghana, for rising to the occasion, taking several innovative and proactive steps to beat the unprecedented challenging situation created by the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, which definitely enabled fast-track development and availability of vaccines worldwide in a very short span of time. Now, just to give you a few examples, like EMA, you already heard about some of the agencies that the good work has been done, but EMA had put in place very early in the game a dedicated expert task force, a rapid and rolling reviews to evaluate high quality applications from companies in the shortest possible time frames while ensuring robust scientific opinions. So these scientific advices from regulators helped developers speed up development by receiving prompt guidance and direction on the best methods and study designs to generate robust data. And the companies were also expanding manufacturing capacity and large-scale production to facilitate vaccine deployment at an early date once these are approved. And the manufacturers had taken the initiative to manufacture at risk before even obtaining the marketing authorization, which could allow them to be ready to distribute doses rapidly enough to meet the demand once these were authorized. Now, let us look at US FDA. One of the fastest EUA was issued on 11th of December 2020 to Pfizer, and within 7 days, Moderna got the EUA for their vaccine. And again, in a little over 2 months, J&J got the vaccine approved for EUA. And it is not only stopping here, but once again, the authorization continued, especially for age extension and then the shelf life extension. Now, almost 3 speakers have mentioned about the ICMRA, and I think it is very important for me to say here that ICMRA is acting as a forum to support strategic coordination and international cooperation among global regulatory authorities. And the aim of all these activities is to expedite and streamline the development, authorization, and availability of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines worldwide. Now, ICMRA members are also working towards increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of regulatory processes and decision-making. Now, you already heard Dr. Rogério on various great initiatives that WHO had undertaken. To give you an industry perspective, these are good regulatory practices and good reliance practices which were issued, and the recommendations which were issued by WHO were extremely helpful to the industry and all the manufacturers. WHO PQ team, I must say, has expedited reviews of dossiers, done desk audits as well as site audits to ensure EUL, and it was the first EUL was granted on 31st of December 2020, followed by 2 more on 15th February, and then of course you have been seeing several EULs coming forward. Not to leave behind the NRAs, and I'll just give you, because of paucity of time, I'll just give you example of NRA in India, which last year itself on 27th of March had made efforts to provide quick access to vaccines and drugs to treat COVID-19. And this year on 15th of April, the DCGI, the Drug Controller General of India, has, based on the consensus of NEGVAC, that is the National Expert Group on Vaccine Administration for COVID, gave permission to foreign produced vaccines which have already received EUA by SRAs, including US FDA, EMA, UK MHRA, and PMDA. Now, in summary, if we have to look at the achievements that we have so far achieved with this global regulatory alignment and reliance, is that within 324 days, the first vaccine has been rolled out, and within less than 100 days, the vaccines have reached 177 countries from the day of first rollout. And this morning, you must have heard Rasmus, who said that 3.3 billion doses have been produced and delivered in less than 6 months, which is a great, great achievement by the industry, with support only from the regulators and all other collaborating agencies worldwide. And I must say that at least I don't have the right estimate, but probably around 50% of this contribution has come from developing country vaccine manufacturers, and we continue to accelerate. However, having said that, with all these achievements, there are also challenges which are, definitely you cannot just leave them, because the accelerated development and subsequent emergency use authorization has resulted into some of the challenges, which we can probably classify in 5 categories. And the challenge number 1 is the different legislative requirements for all countries, because not all countries have the same legislative framework. They don't have the same regulatory requirements. They don't have same regulatory procedures or even timelines. So, coming to the fast development and approvals also trigger a number of additional challenges, like validation of processing data, optimized control strategies, additional data which has to be gathered from additional number of batches, evolving process understanding and then optimization, and so on. And the third challenge, which I would like to highlight here, is that all the NRAs all over the globe came up with accelerated approval pathways for COVID-19. However, somehow, the developing accelerated pathways for post-approval changes probably has been missed out. And this is something which still needs serious attention. One of the challenges which we have encountered is regulatory collaboration and dependency, because most of these vaccines are registered based on technology transfer and small bridging clinical studies that allow in vivo safety and immunogenicity comparison with the originator. So, there is a dependence on the global clinical trials, which is required by local regulators. And therefore, there is a need for a reference NRA. And this is something which is important and which can consume time. The other, I would say, and I will limit here, is the variation management, because the situation is less clear on how it is going to work for variations and for regular registration once the EUAs expire, because these are temporary decisions. So changes are required to scale up capacity, including the addition of new production site, which may require certain attention. But I must say, and this has been said earlier also, that the industry, particularly IFPMA, DCVMN, and sister associations, they have developed and shared with ICMRA a number of globally focused recommendations to address the regulatory challenges associated with manufacturing site transfers that we believe, if implemented, would enable the rapid increase of manufacturing capacity for the production of COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines. The impact of all this is basically can be summarized in one simple sentence, that this has facilitated the industry to take a huge task of delivering over 11 billion doses by end of 2021. And that is, I think, going to be a great accomplishment for the whole collaboration that all agencies worldwide have done together with the industry. So, of course, you asked us to give one example of the best practices, and here I would say the global regulatory collaboration is something which is really great, and collaborative review and reliance practices could be adopted on a broader basis, coupled with rolling reviews, which have definitely yielded results, demonstrated the successes, and this should be continued. And one thing which probably we shouldn't be doing is that we should not keep on waiting for the next pandemic and then start searching for solutions. I think we need to act now. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Rajinder. That was excellent. Thank you for being very clear on the manufacturer's position and perspective, and actually ending on a very positive note on how manufacturing capacity is being ramped up, and the expectation for the end of 2021. And I think you also highlighted to us some of the challenges. It's been great to hear about all the collaboration, but it's also good to know about the challenges, and especially that last part that you said, that it's time to actually start working and working now quite concretely before another pandemic comes, in terms of how we can distill all of these lessons. And here, if I can just say quickly before moving to the next speaker, that I think that there's a strong, it seems to me a lot of the issues that have been spoken about transparency, cooperation, alignment to international standards, they all have a very strong trade component, because these are all very much the key principles, disciplines that you will find in the technical barriers to trade agreement. So there seems to me a lot of synergy here between what can be done on the trade side and what can be done on the regulatory side. And the link, as you've been saying, about developing that collaboration and cooperation seems to be a very fruitful one. So we'll have time to get more into that, perhaps after everyone has spoken. Unfortunately, the CEO of Kiara Health, Dr. Shukumbuzo Ngozwana, is not able to join us right now. So we'll turn to our speaker from UNIDO, Alistair West, who's business plan coordinator, pharmaceutical and manufacturing plan for Africa. So Alistair, be great to hear from you about the UNIDO's experience in health-related industrial development, and more particularly in light of the pandemic, UNIDO's perspective on what needs to be done to strengthen and expand manufacturing capacity for essential medicines and vaccines. And as with all the other speakers, if you have any lessons or more than that, best practices that you would like to share, this would be really welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ho, and thank you also to the WTO for the opportunity to be part of this panel. This pandemic has underlined the need to strengthen productive capacities in the pharmaceutical sector in the Global South. Furthermore, it's brought to the fore the long-held ambitions of many countries to develop their health-related industries. A strong pharmaceutical industry in developing regions would diversify sources of supply for essential health products and increase the resilience of supply chains for future pandemics. It would also help to address the inequities that we are seeing in access to innovative products, such as the COVID-19 vaccines. Furthermore, the Global South continues to bear a disproportionate burden of disease, and reliable availability of a broad range of high quality, safe, effective, affordable essential medicines would not just improve pandemic preparedness, but could also help improve health outcomes more generally. Whilst the focus at the moment is on bringing this pandemic to an end, we're also thinking about how to build back better. How can we ensure that we are more prepared for future pandemics? And how can we improve the overall supply of essential medicines and vaccines? I think it's fair to say that there's now a consensus that strengthening health-related industries in the Global South should be a priority. To that end, a strong regulatory environment is key. Substantial investments are required to build new productive capacities and to upgrade existing facilities. And regulatory oversight is critical to reassure investors and sponsors that markets will not be eroded by substandard and falsified medicines. Whilst further progress on regulatory strengthening is vital, there's also a need to address other aspects of the market and the business environment so that companies can make the requisite investments. When it comes to essential medicines, there's a need for companies to expand their product portfolios as well. We need to implement solutions to enable companies to access affordable finance, to benefit from time-limited incentives, and to access, build, and retain the human capital they need. We should also consider how to regionalize the value chains. The concentration of global supply for APIs, for example, and other inputs in a few countries increases the risk of supply shocks. It also puts a strain on the working capital for manufacturers. So all of these issues speak to the importance of further harmonization of markets, not just from a regulatory perspective, but also from a broader trade facilitation point of view. Expanded intra-regional trade in essential medicines would enable different nations to engage in pharmaceutical value chains. This would require stronger standards and conformity assessment infrastructure to be in place. Through engagement across countries, we could and further consolidate markets through moving beyond the perceived zero-sum game. And we can enable different nations to realize economic development benefits, as well as improving access to medicines. When it comes to vaccines, the investments required are substantial and the market dynamics are different. The range of products involved is smaller, manufacturing is very sensitive to economies of scale, and assets can be fungible. And in Africa, for example, there are only a few incumbents. At the moment, global demand is significantly outstripping supply, but new facilities will need to be viable under steady state market demand. How can capacity be kept warm over an extended period and be ready to receive, and companies ready to receive technology and meet a surge in demand at some uncertain point in the future? The international community has a lot of experience in applying advanced market commitments and other market shaping and risk reduction mechanisms. These approaches could be applied in tandem with technical and political initiatives to support enhanced vaccine manufacturing capacity in the Global South. Finally, I would like to emphasize the role of partnerships and alliances. A key to success will be how well international and local private sector come together, how well international development partners join forces with governments, and whether constructive partnerships can be established and maintained over time. As we develop plans to diversify the sources of supply for different medical products, regulatory strengthening is vital. Investment in and upgrading of productive capacities needs to be supported, and countries need to be able to collaborate in a spirit of mutual interest. A holistic and nuanced approach to the development of health-related industries, harnessing the power of trade, is critical. Accordingly, UNIDO has established a strategic health initiative to leverage its expertise and work in collaboration with many partners to help drive progress on this critical agenda. Thank you, and on that note, back to you, Ho.
No, thanks very much, Alistair, and thanks for bringing in deeper focus issues of trade and trade facilitation, and how they go hand in hand, as you were saying, with regulatory strengthening. And I think that's a really important and interesting perspective, that, you know, it's about, again, this mutual supportiveness between what one manages to do on the regulatory side to ensure quality and safety and alignment and reliance, and how that is also buttressed, if you like, with trade and trade facilitation and principles, again, of transparency, non-discrimination, again, alignment to international standards and collaboration. And so I think it's a very fruitful area to be thinking about, and to seeing how we can use both of these perspectives and instruments in preparedness for further pandemic crisis. And of course, we work already very closely with UNIDO, and you also pointed a bit to the need for I would call it quality infrastructure, an area which, of course, UNIDO works very closely in, and which has an aspect to TBT as well. So thank you for that. Let me turn to Dr. Raj Long, who is an independent expert advisor on regulation and access. And so, Dr. Long, based on what you've heard so far today, and then you can take a step back because you are an independent expert advisor, you know, what can we learn from the regulatory responses of this pandemic? How can we better prepare for the next pandemic? And in this segment of the panel, we're hearing more and more about the importance of local manufacturing, ramping up manufacturing capacity in developing countries, and the sort of regulatory framework that is needed to accompany that. So in terms of that, you know, if I can call it regulatory capacity, what are the criteria that you think we need to think about for local manufacturing of vaccines, and to have this sort of positive reinforcement that I was hearing from a few other speakers between trade on the one hand and regulation on the other hand? So your thoughts on that, and any best practices for us to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to WTO for giving us this opportunity to be here today to share our thoughts on this very pertinent and timely topic. As I listened to the different presentations and insights from the other speakers, I think you can't avoid stepping back and looking to see what did COVID present to the world. We know it's a global pandemic, but in that context, you need to look at COVID, at least I look at COVID, in two different perspectives. One is, it was a phenomenal disruptor. Its disruption on health and the impact on socioeconomic arenas across the world was, you know, cannot be ignored. However, within this disrupting aspect of any global pandemic, and one that we weren't really very well prepared for, there was also this immensely opportunistic accelerator within COVID. So COVID, I think, presented in two paradigms. One, as a major disruptor, which is what we all saw at the beginning. But as it evolved, there is also this phenomenal, it acted as an accelerator. And where did it act as an accelerator? And I think it is, we've never seen a vaccine going from sort of lab to patient in about 9 to 10 months. That's an accelerator. And how was that acceleration achieved is really to many of the comments we heard from the regulators earlier on, Rajinder, in terms of how that work came together, be that in clinical trial development, regulatory review, or in safety. If you look back and say, what have we learned from this? I think there are certain behaviors that we need to look at, and how did those happen? And I would say collaboration came out over and over again from all of the regulators and the speakers representing industry here. Whether that collaboration was at ICMR level, ICH, at the international level, but also at the national level within a country. June spoke about her independent experts. Mimi in Ghana talked about pulling together the academics and researchers in this area field. So what regulators did, whether you were a stringent regulator sitting in a high-income country where you're much better resourced than you would be in another part of the world, they used the resources they had. And I think that is key here in terms of, and in a collaborative way. So the collaboration at those different levels enabled a certain common goal, and wanting to defeat that common goal, defeat the pandemic. So, but the collaboration alone is sometimes not enough. I think we also need to bring in, and I'm not sure this came through in a consistent way, but I picked it up in a couple of the regulators, transparency. This particular session is called regulatory transparency, but transparency shouldn't be limited just to regulators. I think transparency should be on all parties. That includes manufacturers, because the one thing that will disrupt acceleration in any arena are surprises. So regulatory transparency is key, but I think in that collaboration and collaborative platform, there also needs to be transparency from developers, from industry, in such a way that proprietary information and conflicts of interest, all of those are managed. I think with collaboration and transparency, what we saw here was very agile decision making. That's what enabled some of the accelerated timelines that several of the regulators talked. But it's the transparency and coming together and sharing that enabled regulators to also take informed risks, because drug development or vaccine development in the best of times is not risk averse. So being informed, I think, is key, and transparency by design. And I think that's the key word I want to say. Don't expect it to happen in a dynamic way. I think it needs to be built in so that the processes enable that. All this said, I think that's what I would take as a key takeaway in the context of what we've heard so far in the pandemic. Moving very quickly, it's a two-part question I had, was local manufacturing. Within this acceleration, I think what was a disruptor was vaccine access. And I think that still plays out today. We've heard some 11 billion as a number that needs to be brought. We need to make sure that for a future pandemic, if we need to think about it, I think what didn't work so well in the current pandemic is access to vaccines. Nationalism or vaccine nationalism, whatever we want to call it, is a reality. I don't, trying to make sure it goes away, I think is not so realistic. So within that reality, what do we need to do to ensure we have scalable manufacturing? And scalable manufacturing has multiple facets, and I think WTO, you can play a key role here, because if you want to look at manufacturing, you need to look at the whole ecosystem of supply chain, of trade, imports, exports. We saw many of this play out earlier on when there were export stoppages or disruption to supply chain that were put in place. So I think WTO, I think here for the next pandemic, if you think of local manufacturing, you can play a key role, whether that is in sharing technology, which I think is to the core of some of the work that we've heard from WTO. In this particular case, the vaccine technology, facilitating that sharing, I think could go a long way. Import, export could go a long way in terms of helping countries overcome those. But most importantly, I think ensuring The countries that have lesser resources really have a fair shot at equitable access. To me, that is where the key piece. If you overlay that with a shortage of supply, then it is not a surprise some countries will always struggle getting vaccines, as we saw in this. So we want to do something proactively for the next pandemic. What we have learned today is on multiple areas, I think you need to look at the whole ecosystem and then by design, look at what didn't work and reverse that to see how it could work for the future. And I think there's multiple examples that we have seen so far. So some very good examples that we saw in terms of what collaboration enabled, working together both at different levels, internationally and locally. But then we also see some continuing disruptors to even today in the context of vaccine supply and the inequity of vaccine supply. That needs to be tackled. And particularly in the pandemic and the virus that we are talking about, the paradigm of, no one is safe until everyone is safe is critical. So we can't ignore that aspect of that in that context, and almost becomes a duty to enable making sure there is equitable access. And I hand it back to the chair to say, from a WTO perspective, there is many aspects here that you can certainly help the world with, whether it's for this pandemic or the next pandemic. Over.
Okay. No, thanks very much, Raj. No, that was really very good. I think you've actually could have summed up the whole symposium, because you covered all aspects, not just the particular aspect that we are working on in this particular session, but I think it's very clear the sort of areas of lessons that we can take from this. I won't try to touch on everything, but I think just to mention what you said, transparency by design, I think it's actually a really a thought-provoking one. I mean, we have certain instruments at the WTO through the WTO agreements where, in a way, it's transparency by design, because it's required by the members of the WTO to notify under different agreements. But then there's a little question mark there, which is that sufficient? Because that is, the agreements were designed not for pandemic situations. These are for normal situations, and they may not touch on everything that you've talked about, but that would be interesting to drill a bit deeper into. And yes, again, scalable manufacturing, ramping up manufacturing capacity. What are the challenges here? I can only agree with you, the need to look at a whole supply chain, or as you put it, ecosystem, and clearly trade, be it in the form of inputs, outputs, exports, imports, are going to be key to this. So I rather than have all of my views, I'd rather hear the views of everyone else, including the participants who are on this webinar. As I said, if you have a question, please do submit them to the Q&A. We have about 15 minutes or so to get your inputs to this discussion. So please, I encourage you to think about this and to see if you have anything that you would like to come back on from what you've heard so far. And I will be assisted by my colleague Devin, who's with me here, to see how we can get the many of the questions on. Doesn't seem as though we have any right now. So if that's the case, maybe I could just kick off a little bit more. On the WTO side, many of you have had different perspectives, different ideas that you've put out. And what would be the one thing that you would like WTO to do in this space of helping regulatory cooperation? Let's put it very broadly. Helping regulatory cooperation that would address this challenge of more trade facilitation, and in that sense also ramping up manufacturing capacity. And maybe I could just go through the panel and take your responses to that. Whoever would like to start, you can just raise your hand or just unmute yourself and just jump in. That's also fine. or maybe I can. Well, why don't I start with Dr. Gaspar from the WHO? From your perspective, what do you think you would like to see more happen here at WTO in this regulatory space?
Thank you very much. Let me first try to put into context which are the major gaps that we need to solve for the next pandemic or a later stage of this pandemic, because just to remember, we are still in a pandemic. And even though there are countries where we are close to 70% of the population, at least with one dose, we have countries with less than 1% of the population having taken the first dose. So this is a global reality that we are still on the middle of it, and we still have a number of targets that we are imposing to ourselves. And just to remember the appeal from the Director General of WHO to reach at least 10% of the population of each country being vaccinated by September, and at least 40% of the population of each country by December. So having said that, I've seen since I arrived at WHO in January a big change, and that big change, and I would say between February and May, between our executive board and our World Health Assembly, was on the production side. So when I arrived here in January, and there was a proposal from the member states table for the World Health Assembly on the strengthening the local production of vaccines, medicinal products, and medical products in general. It was supported by 13 member states, and it was almost impossible to have it approved. In May, it was approved by consensus with the support of all member states and co-sponsored by 105 member states. At the same time, we had a number of initiatives from the US government, from G7, from President Macron, and more recently on the Manufacturing Task Force alongside COVAX, with a recent announcement by the DG of WHO and the President from South Africa about the technology hub on mRNA products. So what changed here is the concern that was evident on everybody's mind was translated in cooperation to get to some specific objectives on the manufacturing side. And let me be very clear, because with my responsibilities at WHO, I'm saying this in every internal or external meeting, and Raj knows that I say this in almost every meeting we are together. By no means we should reinforce manufacturing capacities in countries without regulatory oversight. So we are doing that, we are working together. Just to give you an idea, this is my 4th meeting today in which these issues have been tackled, starting with the GMP inspectors consultation, going through a good regulatory and good reliance practice seminar organized by WHO with more than 750 people from more than 100 countries, and also a consultation, a member states consultation on the substandard and falsified medicines, and now this one. So when I see this all together and the capacity that we have to put everybody to collaborate, one specific issue that was already referred by Raj, that WTO can help, and probably only WTO can help, is to stop the barriers on the supply chain. Because if we do everything from our side, which means from the health side, from the regulatory side, and even the politicians from their side in terms of having the streams for funding intensively local production capacity all over the world. But if the commercial barriers are there in a way that at the slightest problem in one country, borders get shut and global supply for raw materials is stopped, then all the efforts are not able to deliver what we have the ambition to do. So I think that from WTO, the more specific and more concrete and deliverable would be to have a way of stopping those barriers that are hurting us when we have hundreds of materials that are needed for completion of manufacturing production of one unique vaccine. And when we need several vaccines, and we need all the vaccines that are quality assured that are out there, that's for sure. And we are learning that lesson then the role of WTO is more evident than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gaspar. That was very clear and very helpful. And you actually did already preempt what was my next question, which was that what would be your takeaway from the discussion, and a very clear call here for WTO member governments actually on what they can do to ensure that the supply chain continues to flow. So I think we don't have that much time left. So let me just go around the panel and bundle my question together on what you would like WTO to do with your take home from the discussion. I see on my screen, actually just happens to be on my screen right now, is Alistair West. So Alistair, your take home, and then we'll just go through the panel. Thank you. You're muted, I'm afraid.
My apologies. I'll try and be very brief. I think the key takeaway from the discussion for me is that a lot's been learned from this pandemic. And I think as we plan for the future, there's a lot of knowledge and new understanding that can be applied for future preparedness. But I think we also need to acknowledge that we don't know what the next pandemic will be, and we don't know what the solutions will be in treating that. So I think, as well as making sure that access to COVID-19 vaccines are accelerated as quickly as possible, we should be thinking quite broadly about the impact the pandemic's had, not just in terms of the COVID-19 itself, but also in terms of the broader implications for access to medicines and access to vaccines. So, and as you've mentioned, I think trade will be a critical factor in enabling an improvement in access to essential medicines, as well as through building productive capacities in the global south. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. Thanks for that perspective. Let me turn to Dr. June Raine. Dr. Raine, I'm glad you were able to come back to the seminar. Your perspective and your take home. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Holim. The moment now is when we need to discuss, just as we're doing, the importance of convergence and regulatory ability to come together to remove these barriers that regulators happen to have created purely by, over the years, the ad hoc nature of regulation by different products. But regulatory convergence and transparency will make an enormous difference. We really need to act now, and anything that the WTO can do to support that, particularly in the area of manufacture, will be critical. I think we need to challenge ourselves. We didn't think it was possible to produce a vaccine in under a year. Now we're challenging ourselves with 100 days, and it can be done. So let's converge. Thank you.
Excellent. That's very much part of the work that we are doing here in our particular area on TBT. So that's a very clear takeaway. Let me ask Delese Mimi Darko for her final remarks.
Thank you very much. Coming from an LMIC point of view, our main problem is access to these vaccines. And no matter what we have done, even with regulatory convergence and collaboration, etc., we still have not been able to get enough vaccines. As I said before, for most of us, it's actually under 1%. And we are aware that for other parts of the world, the vaccines are available, probably not enough for everybody or to do the entire population. But there's this saying that we've all come to hear during this pandemic, is that we are not protected until all of us are protected. So is there any way that WTO can mediate between the havers and the seekers? So those who have enough and can go on to 3 doses, and those who do not even have 1 dose, can anything be done? Regulatory, as Dr. Raine said, we're moving towards convergence. We're moving towards ensuring that the regulator will not put impediments in the way of trade. So in what way can trade also support regulators to support their countries to get access to these so badly needed vaccines? So that would be my point to make now, and for consideration, if at all, if it is possible by WTO. Thank you very much.
No, certainly. I mean, what you've highlighted is very much the discussion going on in this symposium, and thank you for joining the dots between the different parts of the symposium. Actually, my colleague Anthony Tautman from the IP division is setting up next to me. I'm sure he'll have some perspectives and answers to the questions that you raise, actually. So if you can, it might even be good to stay on for the next session, who will be speaking more directly on the issues of vaccines and vaccines access. Dr. Fujiwara, maybe a few thoughts from you before we finish on how you see things going forward?
Thank you very much. I have one comment. National regulatory authority should build regulatory confidence for technical aspects with other regulators through the activities such as ICH, ICMRA, PICS, or GMP inspections. And also information sharing, free discussion, and good communication with each other enhance us to do good regulatory convergence, reliance, or recognitions. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Dr. Fujiwara. I think that those are very helpful points. Rajinder, could I come to you on your perspective?
Thank you very much, Holim. I think, during the pandemic, when it was at peak, the one thing which was important was every day. And during the manufacturing supply chain, if one material is also not available, the whole manufacturing chain comes to a grinding halt. And this is what we experienced during March and April, when the supply chain was getting impacted because of the trade barriers on certain inputs which were required for upstream and downstream of vaccine manufacturing. And I think Dr. Rogério has already highlighted that point, and I would only like to echo that I think WTO particularly should take those steps now to make sure that by the end of this year, and also if there is we don't wish, but if there is any pandemic in future, these problems do not come, at least in front of the manufacturers, to ramp up the capacities and then make sure that there is an equitable distribution all across the countries. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Rajinder. And I give the last 30 seconds, if I can, to Raj Long, and then we'll have to wrap up for the next session.
Thank you. What can I say in 30 seconds? I think in the context of this panel, the regulators have illustrated and shown that they can be agile and effective in bringing products quickly. I think that we've seen evidence of it. The problem we still need to deal with, and I'll echo what both Rogério and Mimi have said, is in spite of that, a regulatory approval is only an approval if the product cannot get to a patient. And this is where I think WTO can really play a role in looking at the whole ecosystem of equitable access. It's not any one thing or one element that is currently being the hurdle to overcome. Depending on where you are, it's a number of things. So if WTO could look at that ecosystem, prioritize, and then focus on the top priorities that would then be catalytic in opening equitable access, then that would be a huge win. And that's what we can learn from this to apply to the next pandemic. Over.
Thanks very much, Raj. I think that's echoes what everyone else has been saying as well. Very clear take-homes here and a very clear agenda for work. And I would just say that it should be work, of course, not just WTO, but all of you on the panel, as well as all the member governments who would have to be a big part of this to find solutions. So thank you all very much. Thanks very much to the participants. I'm sure this subjects of this discussion will carry on, and we would hope to be in touch with you at some point in the future. Thank you all again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.